Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome is a functional bowel disorder characterized by abdominal pains and discomfort and altered bowel movements without any structural abnormalities. The diagnosis is based on clinical presentation, and there is a predominance of female affected by this syndrome. Okay, there are 10 to 20% of adults and adolescents having irritable bowel syndrome. Before we use in 2016, we used to use ROM3 as a criteria in the diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, but right now we use the ROM4 criteria. So by definition, IBS is a functional bowel disorder characterized with abdominal pains and discomfort with altered bowel movement habits. And there is no detectable structural abnormalities. Okay, what is the ROM4 diagnostic criteria for IBS? There is a history of recurrent abdominal pain on the average at least one day per week in the last 3 months associated with 2 or more of the following criteria. First, it is related to defecation or bowel movement. It is associated with a change in frequency of defecation or stool, and it's also associated with a change in the form or the appearance of the stool. The criteria fulfilled for the last 3 months with no symptoms onset at least 6 months prior to the diagnosis. Malnutrition in IBS is rare. There is unusual sleep deprivation, and it is said that the IBS may be exacerbated by your eating or emotional stress, and it's improved by the passage of your flatus or stools. Female patients have worsening symptoms, usually during premenstrual or menstrual phase. What are the clinical features? First is abdominal pains. It is a prerequisite. All IBS should complain of this, abdominal pains. It may be episodic or crampy. Usually this is only mild, and sometimes it can be ignored by the patient. Pain is usually relieved by passing out gas or flatus. And among females, as I said, the pain worsens during premenstrual or menstrual phase. What about the altered bowel habits? This is a consistent feature of IBS. The most common pattern is constipation alternating with diarrhea. Most patients feel have incomplete bowel evacuation. So there are three types. You have IBS predominantly constipation, which is IBS-C, and IBS predominantly diarrhea, or IBS mixed type, meaning to say there's an alternating problems of constipation and diarrhea. Number 3 is your gas and flatulence, okay? Patients would always complain of abdominal distension or increased belching or flatulence. The upper GI symptoms, sometimes dyspepsia, heartburn, nausea, and vomiting, may be maybe symptoms also of IBS. Around 25% to 50% of IBS may have concomitant dyspepsia and heartburn. So there is an overlap between your dyspepsia and IBS. What is the pathophysiology? The pathophysiology of your IBS until now is poorly understood. The cause of your IBS is multifactorial. Evidence of visceral hypersensitivity and motility disorders are seen, and few may have genetic abnormalities. 30% of patients may have bile acid malabsorption. Gut dysbiosis and impaired mucosal permeability is also being considered. So the cause of your IBS is likely to be multifactorial. Your patient may often have evidence of visceral hypersensitivity and motility abnormalities. many of which have increased anxiety or depression in their symptoms. Genetic studies suggest a few IBS patients may have genetic abnormalities affecting the serotonin transport system in the enteric nerves. About 30% of your IBS patients may have bile acid malabsorption, gut dysbiosis, and impaired mucosal permeability have been reported in many of your patients. This may lead to subclinical mucosal inflammation. So how do you manage patients with irritable bowel syndrome? Patient counseling is important and dietary alteration. Reassurance and careful examination of your patients is necessary. Meticulous dietary history that aggravates the symptom should be considered. Example, coffee, disaccharides, legumes, and cabbages may exacerbate the symptoms, so you try to limit all the intake of this. Excessive fructose and artificial sweeteners may lead to loose bowel movement and bloating and cramping and flatulence. So you advise your patients to avoid all of these. These foods, even drinks, aggravates the symptomatology that the patient is having. Stool bulking agents or high fiber diet is very helpful. You may give anticholinergics or antispasmodics for patients complaining of risk of crampy abdominal pains and bloatedness. Anti-diarrheal agents or low dose of your loperamide in 2 to 4 milligrams can be given if patient is suffering from IBS, predominantly diarrhea. Antidepressant drugs are given for patients with depression and anxiety. Anti-flatulence therapy is also given. So, to modulate your gut flora, you may give rifaximin. Prebiotics and probiotics are available. Serotonin receptor agonists and antagonists are being used as well. For your antagonists, 5-HT antagonists such as your allocentrone, this is given for IBS diarrhea. And for your 5-HT agonist exemplified by your tegaserod, this is being given for IBS constipation. Let's go now to anorectal diseases. The first is rectal prolapse. This is 6 times more common among women, elderly women at that, more than 60 years old, and are highly associated with pelvic floor disorders. Usually patients would complain of urinary incontinence, rectocele, cystocele, and enterocele. Prosidentia is another term for rectal prolapse. It is characterized by circumferential full thickness protrusion of your rectal wall. This is associated with redundant sigmoid, pelvic laxity, and deep rectovaginal septum or pouch of Douglas. The result of damage to the nerve supply of the pelvic floor muscles. So what is affected is your pudendal nerve specifically. So how do you manage patients with rectal prolapse? You may give stool bulking agents or fiber-rich foods. It may be corrected by surgical correction of rectal prolapse, which is the mainstay of the treatment. So it may be done by a transabdominal approach or transperineal approach. What about hemorrhoidal diseases? Hemorrhoidal cushions are a normal part of the anal canal. You have 3 hemorrhoidal cushions. You have the left lateral located at the 3 o'clock, right anterior complex located at 11 o'clock, and the right posterior located at your 7 o'clock. Engorgement and straining leads to prolapse of this tissue outside of the anal canal, which may give rise to 2 types of hemorrhoids, your external hemorrhoids and your internal hemorrhoids. External hemorrhoids originate below the dentate line and are covered by squamous epithelium. While your internal hemorrhoids, this originates above the dentate line and is covered with mucosa and transitional zone epithelium. So what will be the presentation? Usually, painless bleeding is being complained by the patient. There may be protrusion. There may be pain if it is thrombosed, and there may be concomitant pruritus. So an external thrombosed hemorrhoid may give rise to a very painful, anal, painful anal pain. In other words, anal pain is a frequent complaint, and patients would always tell you that they cannot even defecate or even sit down because of the pain. So this is a typical example of your external thrombosed hemorrhoids. Patient would tell you that they are able to palpate uh, some a nodule or a mass protruding in the rectum, which is very tender or very painful. So think that this is an external thrombosed hemorrhoid. So on diagnosis, okay, you do direct rectal examination or you may use anoscopy. Later on, you might do more diagnostic exams such as your sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy to rule out malignancy in the elderly. So what are the stages of your and treatment of your hemorrhoids? You have 4 stages or 4 grades. So grade 1 to 4 or stage 1 to 4. So your stage 1, it is described that there is enlargement with bleeding of your hemorrhoid, and you treat this with your fiber supplementation. You may give short course steroids, or you may give suppository and sclerotherapy or infrared coagulation. Your grade 2, there is protrusion with spontaneous reduction. Excuse me. So again, this is being managed by same as your stage 1. Your stage 3 has protrusion requiring your manual reduction. So it cannot be reduced spontaneously, but you have to push it back. So again, the treatment now is fiber supplementation. You may give steroids and suppositories, and this time rubber band ligation, or you may opt to do operative hemorrhoidectomy. Stage 4 means that there is irreducible protrusion. So the fiber supplementation and steroids, but this time rubber band ligation is not already a consideration, but surgery is the main, the best treatment option for irreducible hemorrhoids. So again, in summary, this is the management that we can do for patients with suffering from inflamed or enlargement of your hemorrhoids. You may give high fiber diets. You may ask your patient to do hot sitz bath, may give stool softener. You may do rubber band ligation, sclerotherapy for bleeding, and infrared coagulation. Your surgical intervention is entertained in grade 3 and grade 4. What about the complications? Complications are you may develop pain, infection, recurrent bleeding, and sometimes urinary incontinence. Okay? So what about anal fissure? Anal fissure occur at all ages, but are more common in the 3rd through the 5th decades of life. The most common cause of rectal bleeding in infancy is anal fissure. So males and females incidence are equal. This is associated with constipation, with diarrhea, infectious etiologies, perianal trauma, and even Crohn's disease. So what is the pathophysiology of your anal fissure? Trauma to the anal canal following defecation is the definition of this. This is common in the posterior anal canal, but may also occur in the anterior. So your differential diagnoses are tuberculosis, syphilis, Crohn's disease, and malignancy. Irritation caused by the trauma to the anal canal results in an increased resting pressure of the internal sphincter. The classic complaint of your rectal fissure is, of course, pain. This is strongly associated with defecation and is so relentless. The bright red bleeding with the fissure is less extensive than with the hemorrhoids. Chronic fissure is defined as hypertrophied anal papilla at the proximal end of the fissure and a sentinel pile or skin tag at the distal end. If anal manometry is performed, elevation in the anal resting pressure and a sawtooth deformity with the paradoxical contractions of the sphincter muscles are pathognomonic. So how do you manage patients with anal fissure? You give stool softeners, you increase the dietary fiber, you give topical anesthetics, you may give glucocorticoids, and hot sitz bath will heal in 60 to 90% of your fissures. Your chronic fissures are those who present for more than 6 weeks. So you may give nitroglycerin or nifedipine ointment because these are smooth muscle relaxant, botulinum toxin type A, and of course, surgical management. Recurrence rates from medical therapy are higher. Lateral internal sphincterotomy may lead to incontinence and more commonly in women. What about abscess or anorectal abscess? Men are more predominantly affected than women, 3:1, and the peak incidence is on the 3rd to 5th decade of life. Patients would complain of perianal pains plus abscesses. It's coming out. More common among immunocompromised patients, those patients who are diabetics, for example, having hematologic problems or IBDs and HIV. So there is a recurrent perianal infection. The pathophysiology of which is infected anal glands due to stool accidentally entering the glands. So what is the presentation? The hallmark is your perianal pain plus fever. One differential diagnosis for this is IBD. There is difficulty in voiding and usually blood is seen in the stool. So what other diagnostic examination that you can see on CBC, you may see predominance of WBC or leukocytosis. By CT scan or MRI, this is 80% accurate, and doing a colonoscopy to rule out IBD. So the treatment, the gold standard is still incision and drainage. Antibiotics is given for immunocompromised or those with prosthetic heart valves and diabetics or IBDs. So let's discuss now the causes of your constipation in adults. So we're done and we're almost done. And right now, I just want to run down the causes of constipation among adults, which is a common complaint of patients coming to the clinic. So we divide this into the recent onset and chronic constipation. For recent onset constipation, usually patients would present with colonic obstruction, anal sphincter spasm. The obstruction may be due to neoplasm, stricture, ischemic, and diverticular inflammatory problem, while your anal sphincter spasm may be an example of these are your anal fissures and your hemorrhoids. What about the chronic reason for your constipation? The chronic reasons for chronic constipation may be due to irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, predominantly constipation, your medications, colonic pseudo-obstruction, disorders on your rectal evacuation, endocrinopathies, psychiatric disorders, neurologic disorders, and generalized muscle disorders. And an example is on the other side of the other side of our slide, okay? So IBS, so constipation predominantly or alternating or mixed type of IBS predominantly, constipation and then alternating with diarrhea. Now the example of drugs that can give rise to chronic constipation may be patients who are on antihypertensive treatments such as calcium blockers and antidepressants, okay? While an example of neurologic disorder is Parkinsonism, multiple sclerosis, and even spinal cord injury, okay? What about patients with presented with lower GI bleeding? So this is a good algorithm, all right, for patients who presents with lower GI bleeding. I'm sorry. Okay, patients who have no hemodynamic instability for age less than 40 years old, flexible sigmoidoscopy would help if there's minimal bleeding, or a colonoscopy is a recommendation if there's a copious bleeding or a family history of colon cancer and even iron deficiency. So patients who are more than 40 years old or more than 40 years, colonoscopy is necessary. Okay? Those patients who are hemodynamically unstable, you may do upper endoscopy first to check whether the bleeding is coming from the upper GI or the lower GI. Now, if the patient is too unstable for bowel prep, for example, you may go to CT angiography to detect where is the bleeding coming from. Okay, if you are able to do colonoscopy, okay, you may identify the site of the bleeding and you may do this therapeutic to control the bleeding. If you are able to identify the site, or if you were not able to identify it, then you may proceed to further workup such as doing an angiography or RBC tagging for that matter. Or eventually, if the bleeding still persists, surgery is recommended. Okay, so a normal colonoscopy, for the information of everyone, this is a good example of a normal colonoscopy with a very clean bowel prep on the patient. Okay, so this is the end point of your colonoscopy, wherein you see the ileocecal valve, all right, and the periappendiceal orifice, as you see on the 12 o'clock. That is a clean periappendiceal orifice. I think that's all for now, and thank you for your for listening. If there are any questions, you may do so and may ask now. Thank you, everybody.